Good evening and welcome once again to this series on rural urology.
Yeah, good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Last 2 weeks we've been discussing about what we can do in what urological procedures as a general surgeons or urologists can do in rural or remote areas. Last week I shared about finding in a place called Arohi or Setoli. Are you getting the slides, Keshav? Okay. And there, you might wonder why we're talking about very remote area in the foothills of Himalayas. The reason I chose that area was that they did not have any work with a urologist when they were doing this program of going from village to village and gathering the data. And I told you that if you compare the number of surgical patients that they found during the 10 years, they had more urology patients than general surgery patients or gynecology patients during that time. You may wonder it may be just a small aberration, but the reason for, as I said, for choosing that area was because I was not involved there as a urologist. But again, my experience in working in Northeast India is that in a remote hospitals in rural areas, whether you have a urologist or whether you don't have a urologist, the fact is that you'll have more number of urology patients turning up than even general surgery patients or gynecology patients, unless these are specialized centers. This is true for almost a decade in Northeast India, in Assam. And again, if you go through the records of various mission hospitals in rural areas, it shows the same thing. We have more urology patients than even general surgery patients in these areas. But then the good news is that although many people have opinion that we need very expensive gadgets and you need urban centers to do urology work, it is possible to do all of them in remote areas. 2 weeks ago, we saw how we can do the urodynamic studies, even in a remote setting. The regular machines or equipment that is available for urodynamic study are very expensive. In fact, I told you when we got the first machine in CMC Vellore, it cost almost 2.7 million rupees to purchase. But then what the information that you can gather from such an expensive machine, with the intelligent understanding, you can get the same thing by doing it in a very low cost way. All you needed was just 2 infant feeding tubes and locally made manometer. And you need to observe the patient to find out the various findings. All you need to do was to differentiate which is abdominal contraction and which is the detrusor contractions. Once you understand the principle and observe it, exactly the same information that you can get from the regular urodynamic machines can be got from this. And we had a look at how we can interpret the various findings when you're doing a urodynamic study. And then we found last week we discussed about how to do a cystoscopy diagnosis. And with just a cystoscope, we can come to a variety of diagnoses. And you can diagnose conditions in the urethra, in the bladder, and even in the kidneys based on these findings. So now we look at just one procedure. If you needed to learn one procedure, the most important procedure that you all can learn is to do how to do a DJ stenting. This will help you to treat most of the patients that we see in rural areas, especially those with stones. And the analysis at various hospitals showed that urinary tract stones are very common. And even in areas like Himalayas where you don't sweat so much and it is cold, if the incidence is so high. It is much higher in places where you sweat quite a lot and you lose quite a bit of fluid in through evaporation and sweating. And these places, it is much more common. So what we'll have a look today is about the procedure called DJ stenting. What is a DJ stent? You might wonder, why is it called DJ? It's just, if you have a look at where are the annotations? Okay. I don't know whether you're able to see the thing. So you have two parts which are almost mirror image of each other and has a shape of a J. And that is the reason it's called double J stent. It's basically a tube which you place from the kidney to the urinary bladder. And the shape is such that one J stays in the kidney and the other J in the bladder to prevent it from coming out or going up or whatever it is. Next slide, please. And why do we, what are the other features? It's a tube which has multiple holes. And what does it do? Basically, what it does is that it extends from the kidney to the urinary bladder and keeps the ureter open. See, normally ureter is a closed pipe, and only when there is peristalsis, urine starts coming down. So once in 2 or 3 minutes, a little bit of urine starts in the kidney and it pushed by peristalsis into the bladder. So normally the ureter is a closed tube. But then when you have the stent, it cannot be closed. Obviously, it has to be open, at least to let the stent. And when you're placing the stent, you will find that it goes in with difficulty. It just about fits the size of the ureter. But then later on, the ureter will dilate about 2.5, 3 times the original size. And this can, instead of DJ stent, you can also call it JJ stent or pigtail stent. And the size is about 24 to 30 centimeters, which is the size which is necessary to go from the kidney to the bladder. Can you have the next slide, please? Okay. What does this stent do? As I said earlier, it keeps the ureter open all the time. And if there is a block, see, normally when we said that when you're passing urine, in men, it can generate normally up to 60 centimeters of water pressure in the bladder. And with the obstruction, especially if there is a BPH or something, that pressure can go up to 90 to 100. But then there is a valve-like mechanism in the uretrovesical junction, which prevents this back pressure from going up. And the kidney pressure is only about 10 to 15 centimeters of water. And then there can be back pressure changes and kidney damage if the pressure becomes high. And that is the damage we want to prevent. And that is the reason why you place a stent, because sometimes there are small stones. It can block the ureter. And this back pressure changes can cause damage to the kidney. But if there is a stent, then what happens is that there is, it prevents back pressure changes and keeps it open all the time. And it is a foreign body. So what the body does is try to push it out. So while trying to do that, the kidney generates higher and higher pressure, because normally the 10 to 15 centimeter pressure which kidney generates is to push the bolus of urine down the ureter. But when there is already a foreign body which is always there, it sends impulses to kidney to slowly keep on pumping harder and harder to overcome this dilatation, or if there is a block, try and push the the stent out. So what it does is, in effect, it keeps dilating the ureter, and it becomes, if it starts as a small thing, and it goes almost 2.5, 3 times the size. So this dilatation again facilitates easy passage of urine from the kidney to the bladder and prevents any back pressure changes. So small stones which are there, this will help just the degenerating with the because the ureter is dilated, will help the urine when the stones come down from the kidney into the bladder. And the other thing which does is that because we walk around and move around, it causes this little bit of flushing, so that the stones can easily come down from the kidney into the bladder. Next one. And so basically, any foreign body, including a stone, the tendency of the kidneys is to push it out into the bladder and out. And then this degenerating actually facilitates it because of all the mechanisms. One, it makes the ureter wide. It prevents obstruction and back pressure changes. The up and down motions create small waves which can flush the stones. Even from the calyces, it tends to come out. And if there is any damage, it can cause, any healing, as you know, will cause contraction. And if it is a circular thing, that contraction will cause stricture. The stent will again prevent such healing and stricture formation. So basically what it does is that it prevents obstruction and back pressure changes. Again, it's the stretching of the capsule which causes pain. So in other words, it will relieve the pain also. So it relieves the pain, it prevents kidney damage, it dilates the ureter and facilitates the stone to come out. Next slide. Okay, so what are the indications for this stenting? So if the stones are small or medium, by medium I mean up to 1 to 1.5 centimeters size stones, just this DJ stenting would suffice. Because when normally even 6, 7, up to 6 or 7 millimeters or 0.7 centimeter size stones, they have 80-85% chance of coming out on their own. Because even though the ureter is a collapsed tube, the normal bolus can stretch the ureter to about 5 millimeters. But then even 6-7 millimeters with a little extra push and force from the kidney, the smaller stones can come out. But then these medium-sized stones, they might get stuck at various places, which you'll see a little later. And they can cause back pressure changes. But another problem with the stone getting stuck is that it'll cause some inflammation and edema. That further increases the chance of block and back pressure change. And when it heals, it can cause stricturing. So all this are prevented if you just pass a stent, and they'll facilitate stones up to almost 3 times the normal size, which is about 1.5 centimeter size, to come down. And then the next most common use that we use is for as a precursor for breaking stones in the kidney. See, normally, traditionally, the ureterinoscope is used for breaking the stones in the lower third of the ureter. And what generally happens is that everybody likes to do everything in one sitting. And so what we used to do earlier when we were in Vellore is that we used to first pass a balloon, dilate the ureteric orifice, then go with the ureterinoscope, which has 2 sizes. Generally, we use a smaller one, which is 7.5 French size, or a larger one, which is about 9 French size. So these again go in with the difficulty because the ureter is small. And we are also causing, because the balloon, we are dilating the orifice, which can cause some bleeding and some injury, which when it heals can cause a stricture. And generally, if there is not much of inflammation, what happens is the urothelium has a nice plane in the lamina propria with the musculature of the ureter. So if it is tight and if you're trying to pull the ureteroinoscope, one of the dreaded complications is that the whole urothelium or endothelium can come off with the scope. Then you're left with no other option to do a major surgery to replace the ureter with the ileum. But then once you do a DJ stent, what happens is that in addition to dilating the ureter, it also causes a little bit of inflammation so that urothelium sticks nicely to the musculature, which prevents the sort of intussusception of the whole mucosa tearing and coming along with the ureter. And then because it's dilated, it's easy to sort of slowly maneuver your way and reach up to comfortably up to the renal pelvis. But then once you have a little more experience, we have been able to remove stones which are in the upper calyx, middle calyx, and even in the lower calyx with doing some sort of adjustments to break these stones to bring into view. So you can use a low-cost rigid ureteroscope to break the renal stones. But of course, the flip side is that you need to first stage, you need to put in a DJ stent, wait for about 6 weeks for the ureter to dilate. And then the next stage, do the ureteroscope, and then break the stones with the lithoclast. And then you wait till all these stone fragments have passed, and then finally remove the thing. So even if a small stone is there, you need 3 sittings. But then the rural patient does not matter because this is a small procedure, absolutely no invasion, no cutting anywhere. And the next day they can be discharged. But then another use of DJ stenting is that, so when you're doing a big retroperitoneal surgeries, the ureteric injury is fairly common. And sometimes, if you don't recognize the ureter where the position, then it's far more easier to injure. And if you don't detect it at the time of surgery, it becomes even more difficult. So at a precautionary measure, if you're doing surgery for a huge uterus or a malignancy of the uterus or any other retroperitoneal lymph node dissections, you can place a DJ stent as a precautionary measure. So the most of the common use is that it is used for small and medium-sized stones as a sole treatment. And many of rural surgeons whom we are trained in Northeast, they are doing that. They put in a DJ stent by themselves and these come out. Almost our experience has been that if the stones are less than 1.5 centimeter, they have about 60 to 65% chance of coming out on their own. And then it's again the next most common use that we use for is as a precursor to the surgery, that when we do the renal stone surgery through the normal urinary passage. And then the third use is the precautionary measure. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the other, actually in this X-ray, you can see very clearly the importance of having a DJ stent. So this patient had a huge renal stone, which we have broken in the first sitting. And now, when you're actually watching the procedure, you'll realize that the stent just about goes inside the ureter. But then if you look at the kidney on the ureter on the left side, some of the stones are fairly big, almost 1.5 centimeter. This is the extent to which the ureter will dilate with the DJ stenting. So the reason why we leave a stent is that once you break the stone, these fragments start coming down. The kidney works hard to push these stones down. And any one of them can cause obstruction. And once they cause obstruction, the other stones can come and pile up. And it's called Steinstrasse, or if in Europe you'll understand, Strasse means street. So it's called a stone street in simple English. If the DJ stent is not there, then it can cause problem. And the other uses are that sometimes if we have any, if they have even if they pass the stone, what can happen is that there can be a stricture, and the stricture can cause back pressure changes and problems. So very often what we do is we break the stricture with a ureteral duodenoscope and put in a stent. As I said, this prevents healing and causes stricture or becomes smaller. So any tendency for any scar tissue is that its size is much smaller, about 80% of the original size. And if it's a circular tissue, if there is a scar, then it becomes much more narrow. And one more use is that if there is a pus in the kidney, this is one way of draining it, because the tendency of pus is that it causes inflammation and block and stricture. But then the stent causes the opposite of what the pus causes. It'll cause the ureter to become large, and also will try and push things through the ureter down. So it is a fairly good means of putting if there is a pus in the kidney, to drain it. Next slide, please. Okay. So these are the indications that we use DJ stenting for. And as I said earlier, this is one procedure anybody, any surgeon can easily learn and do. And you might be wondering that, okay, you need a big setup like regular urologist, which is expensive. It can cost about, in India, about 0.6 million rupees. But then last time we showed you that we developed a laptop cystoscope or a cystoscope, which instead of a telescope, it has a camera in front and can be directly connected to the laptop computer. The advantage is that it costs only about 50,000 rupees or less than $1,000. And this is good enough for diagnostic cystoscopies and for small procedures like DJ stenting. And especially in rural areas, we would like to give prophylactic antibiotics, even though the big Western centers might not like to do that. We would prefer that we give antibiotics, and we generally use third generation cephalosporins and aminoglycoside, either gentamicin or amikacin, just one dose. Because whatever said and done, this is a semi-sterile procedure. Because even if we do everything sterile, the bladder always has some bacteria, so it cannot be 100% sterile. And then the drapes, many of us still use cloth drapes. And once it becomes wet, it is no more sterile. So it is always good to give a prophylactic antibiotic. And because the other reason is that in rural areas, we might not have follow-up for the patient, and if they develop serious infection, it can be serious. Next slide. Okay. So then the patient is placed in lithotomy position. And we clean and drape as for any major surgeries. And as we shared last time, the important thing is to start cleaning from the urethral orifice and go around and clean the entire area. And because of most of the organisms from the colon, so once you come near the anal area, you discard that gauze piece or whatever you use for cleaning. And if available, you use waterproof sheets, because once they become wet, they are no more sterile. And many of the times, you don't really need anesthesia doing it in a women. Local anesthesia should suffice. But if you're not comfortable and if you're not used to it, in men it's safer to use spinal anesthesia and do the procedure. Next slide. Okay, you need to remember, like we discussed last time, while doing the scopy, you need to remember the curve of the urethra. So normally if you hold the penis up, then it becomes only one curve, gentle curve to negotiate. You can see here, because now I don't know, just 1 minute. Annotate. So if you hold this up here, then this becomes a straight line. And you need to pass the scope under vision. And again, you need to remember, if you're using a camera, to have the 12 o'clock position adjusted properly. So that will make your orientation correct and which direction you want to move. So you need to come under vision here. And when you reach this place, the vision goes off. So normally, because there is a curve like that, so you need to bring this portion down here so that it becomes a straight line. Once it becomes a straight line, it's easier to pass because the scope sheets are absolutely straight. And if you're doing it under local, this is the area, because the sphincter is there, the patient will offer resistance. But as we discussed last week, you need to stay there without much pressure. Because after some time, the patient will relax the sphincter, because it's, voluntary muscle, we can't hold it tight for a long time. And then when the sphincter relaxes, then it's easy to push under vision. So you need to make sure that you need to have everything under vision, and all these curves should be in a straight line. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So even if you're doing just you plan for a DG stenting, it's good to, when you have a chance, to inspect the bladder properly. You need to locate the ureteric orifice on both sides, look at the lateral wall, the dome of the bladder, and all these places, so that you don't miss any other lesions. Because if there is a stone, sometimes there may be other stones in the bladder. And these stones, as I said, if they're small, they can even cause obstruction to the urethra. And the back pressure changes can lead to small diverticulum or saccules forming, in which the stones can get stuck. So it is important to have a good look at the bladder before you do anything. And the way to identify the orifice is that first you withdraw the scope so that you have a look at the bladder neck. And then if you go in straight, you will have a view of the interureteric ridge or Mercier's bar or whatever you call it. Then you trace it laterally to locate the orifice. Next one. Okay. And the way you identify the orifice is that you'll have these muscles which will separate. So these muscles will, the ureteric muscles will come and then they open like this. And normally when no peristalsis is coming, the ureter is a closed tube. So you may not see anything, it may not, this portion will be closed. So you may not see the opening. But then the trick is to wait there for a couple of minutes so that the bolus of urine comes and opens the orifice. Because if you, even a little bit of poking around with the guide wire or something like that will cause damage. Then once you damage, it's very difficult to find out what is happening. So the important thing is you need to be very, very gentle and do things only under proper vision. Next one. So then once you identify the orifice, the first step is to pass the guide wire. The guide wire, if you notice from outside, is a very flimsy tube. So it is difficult to control it, pass it in the place where you want it. So what we do is first we use the pusher, which comes with the DJ stent as a that's a part which makes it stiff, and then pass the guide wire through the pusher, and so that a little bit of the guide wire is pointing out. And then you come near the orifice, and you adjust the scope so that the guide wire is in line with the orifice. So here again, you need to remember that it is almost like a J shape, the lower end of the uretrovesical junction is. It doesn't come and open absolutely straight. If it does that, then it'll be reflux. So for the sphincter mechanism, it runs in the lower portion of the muscle for a while before opening it. So while passing also, it is good to keep waiting at the orifice and wait for the bolus of urine to come in. If you push when the ureter is closed, even though the tip is flexible, it can still cause damage. So you need to wait, make sure that there are no resistance, and wait till the time the urine bolus comes in so that it makes the passage really wide. So the first step is to pass the guide wire. Then again, it is very important to, you need to remember that it is not an absolutely straight tube. So it curves along the bladder, then goes over the iliac vessels, then the behind on the psoas muscle, then it again turns inside the kidney. So all these curves, when they're negotiating, you need to gently push and make sure that the guide wire passes. So we are going to pass the stent over the guide wire because that guide wire is a flimsy tube and it doesn't cause so much damage. So once that is done, once it goes into the kidney, it either goes to the pelvis or to any of the calyces, and there will be resistance. So you don't want to injure anymore. So once there is a resistance, then when you know that enough of the length of the guide wire is gone in, then you need to remove the pusher. So here, when you push, pulling, the whole thing can come out. So the important thing is to push the guide wire 1 centimeter and pull the pusher out a little bit. 1 centimeter push, pull like that, so that guide wire stays in place. Next slide. Okay, I think you can go back to the previous slide. So then once the pushers totally come out, then you thread the stent over the guide wire and use the pusher to, first the guide wire can be directly pushed. But here again, you need to remember that you need to be gentle and have the guide wire taut, because if it is bending like this, it's difficult to pass either the stent or the pusher over it. So it need to be taut. But again, you have to make sure that it doesn't come out when you're trying to keep it taut. So one of the things which you can do is to have the finger as close to the body as possible, and then hold the guide wire stiff so it doesn't move. And then slowly 1 centimeter by centimeter, you slowly push it. And once you see the end of the, another area where you have a problem with that, while it going inside the thing, as if there is a curve. So you might have to use a little bit of jerk or force to let the stent go inside the orifice. And then slowly push it. So once it reaches the full length, then you can remove the guide wire. One of the problems is that sometimes whoever is assisting you can become a little restless and they want to be ahead of you. So they will not wait till you properly pass the stent and then load the pusher. But then what happens is that if there is a bend in the guide wire, that area becomes difficult to negotiate. And later on, the stenting, the whole procedure will be difficult. And the reason for making the guide wire flexible is that you don't want to cause any injury inside the body, because the urothelium is fairly fragile. And if there is some inflammation and infection, it can cause quite a bit of damage. But then the flip side is that it can easily bend and form unusual shapes, and it becomes more difficult. So you need to be very, very gentle and careful while doing the thing. Next slide. Okay, so the difficulties are that if there is a stone in the uretrovesical junction, then it will be very difficult to have a look at the ureteric orifice. Because normally we said the ureteric orifice will sort of open like this, so that you can see it. But if there is a stone here, the opening can point backwards or towards the head end or sideways. Then it becomes difficult to have a look at the orifice. And if you keep poking in that area with the guide wire, it can cause damage, it can bleed, it can cause damage, it can cause buttonholes and so on. So the important thing is to spend enough time and wait and observe how the bolus of urine is coming out. So in which direction, it'll be sometimes quite easy to see which direction the urine flow is there. If necessary, you can give more fluids and a little bit of Lasix, so that there is sufficient flow of urine. And to shift the orifice, one of the technique you can use it to apply a gentle pressure with the scope, so that the orifice can twist and turn. And if you have a hydrophilic guide wire, that again makes it easier, because that is very, very, when it touches water, the guide wire becomes very, very smooth. So even if there is a small gap, it will keep going in. And if there is a stone there, and if the guide wire goes into difficulty, it sometimes is sufficient just to leave only the guide wire. There may not be any need to even pass the stent, because stent might not go. If the hydrophilic guide wire just manages to go past the stone, it'll be very difficult to pass the stent over the hydrophilic guide wire, or replace the hydrophilic with the regular guide wire and pass the stent. Then you can just leave the guide wire for 1 or 2 days. Even 1 or 2 days is enough to sufficiently dilate the orifice, so that the stone might come out, or later you might be able to do the degestenting. Next slide, please. Okay. Then this is not the end of the thing. So you might have to be very strictly tell the patient that they have a foreign body inside the body. And normally we say that we allow up to, we can keep it for about 3 months. And nowadays we have the newer version of stents, which you can keep it for about 6 months. But then usually it's not necessary. It takes about 6 weeks for the ureter to dilate to the maximum size. So for the first stage of stenting and then to doing the procedure, usually 2 to 6 weeks time is sufficient to do the next stage procedure for breaking the stone. But once a stone is broken, like in say in this patient, is a huge stone. So then you might have to, you can keep it as long as you want, and make sure that the patient drinks enough water to pass about 3.5 liters of urine in a day, which is actually quite a bit of water to drink. So every waking hour, they should drink 1 tumbler of water, and they should drink a lot of water before they go to sleep. And even if they're young, they should drink enough water to get up at least once in the night to pass urine. So all these instructions have to be told to them very clearly. And again, you tell them that it is not safe. It can be serious. It can even cause death if you keep it for a long time, more than 3 months. And and also some people might when people who are very sensitive can have some sort of symptoms because of the stent. Generally, it doesn't cause, nobody notices because it's inside the body and they'll hardly know anything. But then some people can feel a little bit of urine going up when they're passing urine. Because normally there is a sphincter and there is no reflux of urine going up into the kidney. But because the stent is there, when they are passing urine, a little bit of urine will go up into the ureter. And if they use a lot of force, then it might go all the way up to the kidney. And it is the stretching of the capsule which causes the pain. But then some people are very sensitive that even a little bit of stretch can cause this discomfort. And again, you have to tell the patient that whenever these stone fragments are coming down, that involves quite a bit of severe contraction and action by the kidney to push this out. So that again will cause pain. But then when they understand that the stones are coming out, if there is pain, then they tolerate the pain better. And the most important thing is that you have to make sure that they pass at least 3.5 liters of urine in a day when they are at the hospital, because when they are at the hospital, they're more aware of the need to drink water. And they will be conscious because they don't have generally other work, so they will be drinking water. So if they're not able to pass 3 liters of urine when they're in the hospital, they're very unlikely to drink enough to pass more urine when they get back to work and get back home. So yeah, even if they pass 4 or 5 liters of urine, when they go back, they'll pass 3.5 liters of urine in a day. So you need to keep on advising them and make sure that they drink enough water to flush out these stones. Next one. Okay, so then we also give other medication like we give sometimes low dose antibiotic or just one-time antibiotic at the bedtime. This is ciproflox 500 milligrams or so. So this will, because anyway we don't want any infection, because night time is the time when urine stays for a long time and there is no emptying of the urine. So it's better to have some antibiotic coverage at that time. Then alpha blockers like tamsulosin, they help in quicker or easier dilatation of the ureter. And then alkalinizing the urine sometimes prevents these incrustations. So we give these at the post-op period. But then most important thing is to drink sufficient water so that they pass enough urine. Next one. Okay. So what are the new developments in the stents? So I briefly mentioned that we keep these stents that we use generally. These are low-cost ones, a very cheap material called polyurethane. And we don't want to keep them for more than 3 months inside the body. And if they're drinking a lot of water, then it doesn't matter. But then again, it has this, it loses strength and it'll be difficult to take out. And there'll be incrustations with infection and so on. So now they have a new material called carbourethane, which is can be kept for almost 6 months. But then like cardiology, they come out with drug-eluting stents. Some of them are coated with heparin, some with hydrogen and silver nitrate, and some with antibiotics. So these things, if there is a lot of infection and there is an infected stone, and if you're keeping it for pus, then you can, if these are available, then you can use these stents. Then now they're coming out with this biodegradable, degradable stents where you don't need to remove the stent. It'll sort of degrade after 2 to 3 months. But then these are not regularly available. The low-cost ones are the usual polyurethane ones, which are fairly inexpensive and easily available. Thank you for joining in, and bye. Have a great day.